Beijing has ended its diplomatic deep freeze of Australia after a breakthrough meeting in Singapore between Richard Marles and his Chinese counterpart. The Deputy Prime Minister says the pair met for more than an hour, arguing it is important to maintain open lines of communication. For more on this, let's bring in Michael Shoebridge, the Director of the Defence Program at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Thank you for joining us this morning. Firstly, is this a breakthrough? Can it even be called that?
I think we've got to be a little more cautious. It's certainly good big news to have a senior Australian minister meet with their Chinese counterpart. That hasn't happened for 2 years since China began its $20 billion of economic coercion against Australia. So it's good news, but we have to see whether China's actions follow their words before we all start cheering.
That is a good point. And I guess the question really is, can Australia make strides towards a better relationship with China without compromising our own sovereignty?
Well, Danica, I think you're right there, because Richard Marles was very clear in everything he said before the meeting and everything he said since, that the structural policies on China that have been so strongly supported on a bipartisan basis for the last 5 years, they're not up for negotiation with Beijing. So that's things like reviewing foreign investment for security concerns, like we had to with the 5G digital communications decision, countering political interference and cyber hacking into our parliament, and aggression like we saw in the South China Sea with that Chinese fighter jet against the Australian Air Force aircraft. So none of that's changed. Beijing has still wanted the meeting, though, so that's good news.
So how long will it take, do you think, to get the relationship going in the right direction?
Well, it depends on actions. General Wei was striking in his remarks at this Shangri-La meeting, where the Shangri-La event where the meeting happened. He pretty much blamed everybody else for thinking that China was behaving in any way that wasn't about peaceful cooperation and win-win outcomes. It's such a jarring gap between what he says and the experience of an aggressive Chinese military, whether it's in the South China Sea, around Taiwan, around Japan, or on the India-China border. So really, you can't have a dialogue that's based on pretend. There needs to be an acknowledgement of what he's directing his military to do and the gap between his words and those actions.
You mentioned that there hasn't been this sort of communication in the last 2 years at least. What does it say about the relationship between the Morrison government and China? Were there missed opportunities?
Well, I think we can overplay this idea of personal rapport between great people, leaders of nations. This is about a collision of national and strategic interests. And it's not just a bilateral problem that Australia has been having. In the South China Sea, on the 26th of May, it was an Australian aircraft that had a Chinese fighter jet almost cause a mid-air collision. The same day, the Canadians, with an aircraft that was enforcing UN sanctions against North Korea, had a very similar experience from the Chinese. So I do think we overplay the personal warmth basis here. This is about a China using its power aggressively against many nations. I don't think we can put that at the foot of the Morrison government.
So how much then is this about China testing the might of the new Labor government?
I think that's a big part of it. Beijing sees this as an opportunity. Will they be able to get compromise from the new Labor government? I also think it's really, what does Beijing want now? Beijing has just signed a security pact with Mr. Sogavare in the Solomon Islands. It wants less opposition from Australia and others about that. And Mr. Marles is busily reviewing the Chinese lease of Darwin Port, our strategic northern port. They probably want some leverage to stop him making decisions they don't like and to give them a free rein in the South Pacific. Both things would be bad news for our national interests.
You mentioned that this is a start in the relationship moving forward. How do you think the Labor government should handle the situation now as it begins to evolve?
Well, I think they've been very sensible in setting out the grounds for these meetings, which are that there'll be no changes to the bipartisan structural policies that they know are in our national interests. I think not being in a hurry and maybe looking to another minister having contact with their Chinese counterpart, and that's our trade minister, because Beijing lifting some of that $20 billion of economic coercion that they put on industries like lobster and barley and wine, that would be a sign that Beijing really is interested in improving this relationship.
Overall, what is your assessment of the Albanese government's foreign policy approach so far?
I think it's been very strong. I think they're following through on what they said over the last 5 years and during the campaign. They wanted a positive agenda with our partners, allies and friends, and they weren't going to undo the structural elements of our China policy that they supported so strongly in the face of a much more aggressive China. I think they're striking that balance very, very well, and this meeting is an example of that.
It'll be interesting to see how it goes moving forward. Michael Shoebridge, we have to leave it there. Thank you for joining us.